They called him Thomas Weaver, but the mountains whispered a different name, one they would not repeat after dark, because to speak it was to invite its presence. His birth was not marked in any church record, nor in the county registry. Instead, the first account of him appears in the journal of a coal surveyor, who claimed he saw a boy standing alone in the fog at the edge of an abandoned shaft. The boy was barefoot in the snow, his skin pale as bone, and his eyes reflecting no light at all. The surveyor wrote that the boy spoke first, asking a question so strange it lodged in his mind until the day he died. He asked, "What year do you think this is?" And when the man answered, Thomas smiled in a way that suggested he already knew. The answer was wrong. This was in the winter of 1874, a time when West Virginia was choking under the weight of its own secrets, and the mountain towns were bound by a code of silence. Outsiders were watched like predators, and those who asked too many questions often vanished, without leaving behind even a rumor. The Weaver family was known, but never well liked their farm, perched high above a ridge that caught no sunlight. For most of the year, neighbors said the air up there was wrong, heavy, like it carried something ancient and patient. When Thomas first appeared in town, he moved differently from other children. His steps were deliberate, his gaze unbroken, and when he spoke, it was with a rhythm and cadence that felt older than the mountains themselves. Old men muttered that they had heard that voice before. Not in their lifetime, but in stories passed down from fathers and grandfathers. Tales of a boy who appeared once every 100 years, with the same pale skin, the same unblinking stare, and the same name. Each time the boy came, something followed. Storms, floods, strange illnesses, whole families moving away in the dead of night, without a word of farewell. What made Thomas different from the legends was how quickly he drew people in. His presence made the skin crawl, but his words made the mind lean closer. Women dreamed of him. Men woke up thinking they had seen him at the foot of their bed, and those who spent time near him often forgot what day it was or where they had been before they looked into those black eyes that held no reflection and no mercy. The sheriff tried to question Thomas, but the conversation never went the way he intended. The boy would answer every inquiry with another question until the lawman began to feel as if he were the one being interrogated. When asked where he came from, Thomas simply tilted his head and said, "Where do you think I came from?" His voice was soft, but it carried in the air, like something whispered too close to the ear. The sheriff left that meeting pale and distracted, unable to recall half of what was said, and unable to shake the feeling that something had been taken from him. Though he could not name what, the townsfolk began noticing that the boy never ate in public. He would sit at tables with food in front of him, yet the bread would remain untouched, and the soup would grow cold. No one could remember seeing him drink water either, but he never seemed weak or tired. In fact, it was the opposite. He seemed more alert, more focused than anyone around him, and it made those who met his gaze feel as though they were standing under a bright light, with no way to hide their thoughts. Stranger still was the way animals reacted. Dogs growled at a distance, refusing to cross the street if he was near. Horses would rear and refuse to pass him on the road. Cats vanished when he walked by, and chickens fell silent when he passed the Weaver farm. Even the crows avoided the ridge, a sight that unsettled the oldest farmers, who swore they had never seen the sky that empty of wings. Whispers began to circle about his lineage. The Weaver family had no record before 1814, and those who dug deeper found that the earliest Weavers were not born in West Virginia at all, but had arrived suddenly from a region no one could trace to any existing map. The family Bible held only half a page of names, and the ink grew lighter toward the bottom, as though whoever wrote it had run out of time. And then came the night when 3 boys from the town went missing. They were last seen following Thomas up the road toward the ridge. The search party never found them. Only their boots were recovered, lined neatly along the edge of a ravine, each pair facing downhill, as if the boys had stepped out of them, mid-stride, and vanished into the cold, thin air. 2 days after the disappearance of the boys, the town preacher claimed he saw Thomas standing in the cemetery at dawn. The preacher said the boy was speaking in a language he did not recognize, something low and steady that seemed to vibrate in the ground beneath his feet. As the preacher approached, he noticed that Thomas was not alone, though no one else stood beside him. Instead, the shadows cast by the gravestones seemed to gather and lean toward the boy, as if listening. When Thomas saw the preacher, he stopped speaking and smiled with that same unsettling stillness that had begun to haunt the town. The preacher tried to confront him, demanding to know what he had done with the missing children. Thomas gave no answer. Instead, he asked the preacher if he remembered his dreams from the night before, and to the preacher's horror, he did remember. The dreams had been full of cold wind, endless corridors and voices, calling his name from behind locked doors. Thomas whispered that those voices were still calling, and if the preacher listened carefully, he might hear them again when the sun went down. By the end of that week, fear had taken hold so deeply that people began to avoid one another in the street. Conversations stopped when Thomas passed by. Doors were locked earlier, and lamps burned later into the night. Mothers kept their children inside. Fathers returned from the mines without stopping at the saloon. A silence had settled over the town, one that felt heavy and watchful. What no one spoke of was the strange effect Thomas had on time itself. Those who spent even a few minutes with him swore that hours had passed. Others claimed the opposite, that whole afternoons seemed to vanish in what felt like moments. The blacksmith's wife swore she once saw the boy step from one end of the street to the other, without crossing the space between, as though the distance had folded for him. Then there were the miners who worked the shafts near the ridge. They began to hear knocking from tunnels they had sealed decades before, knocks that grew louder whenever Thomas was near. Some of the men refused to work at all, saying the sound was not made by human hands, and that it called for someone by name, though no one would repeat what that name was above a whisper. By the 3rd week, a consensus emerged among the oldest families of the region that whatever Thomas Weaver was, it did not belong entirely to the human order. The town's physician, a man trained in Baltimore and accustomed to diagnosing both the physical and the mental, insisted there was no biological explanation for the boy's unnatural calm, nor for the absence of typical emotional responses, even in moments engineered to provoke fear or pain. Thomas's pulse remained steady, his breathing unaltered, as though his body operated under an entirely separate system of regulation. The physician's notes, which survived in fragments, describe a particularly disturbing examination. He recorded that Thomas's pupils reacted to changes in light at a delayed and inconsistent rate, a phenomenon more consistent with post-mortem ocular decay than with living function. He also observed that the boy's skin maintained an abnormal temperature lower than the ambient air by several degrees, with no discernible vascular constriction to account for the disparity. The conclusion entered in the margin, read simply, not of standard origin. Reports continued to circulate of Thomas, appearing in locations he could not have reached by any ordinary means. A pair of railroad workers claimed to have seen him walking along the high trestle bridge, hours after a rainstorm had made the timbers dangerously slick. When they looked again, he was gone without the sound of retreating footsteps. Minutes later, he was observed standing motionless outside the post office at the opposite end of town in clothing entirely dry. More troubling were the accounts that Thomas seemed to carry an effect beyond his physical presence. Farmers reported livestock refusing to graze in fields where the boy had passed, and in some cases animals broke through enclosures in apparent desperation to flee. A teacher noted that children who interacted with the Maz began speaking in fragmented phrases during sleep, sometimes in dialects older than the settlement itself. By now, the town's cohesion had begun to fracture. Deep divisions formed between those advocating for immediate expulsion and those who feared that any act of removal might invite retaliation on a scale beyond comprehension. Night meetings were held in barns and back rooms, guarded not against human trespass, but against whatever unseen forces seemed to follow the boy's path through the mountains. The decision to act was coming, but no one agreed on what form that action should take, or whether it could succeed at all. It was the night of the harvest moon when the first act of open defiance was attempted. A group of 7 men, all veterans of the last war, gathered in the abandoned sawmill at the edge of the river, carrying with them lengths of rope, iron stakes, and the kind of determination born from fear rather than courage. They spoke little as they prepared their tools, for each knew that naming their target aloud felt like binding themselves to a fate none could escape. Their plan was crude, but rooted in an old superstition said to predate the colonies. If a thing walked like a man, but was not a man, it could be bound to the earth by iron driven into the ground beneath its feet until the soil itself refused to release it. They intended to lure Thomas into the clearing by the mill under the pretense of a lantern show, then fix him in place before dawn could break. But Thomas did not come willingly. He was found already standing in the clearing as though waiting for them. His gaze held each man in turn with an unreadable depth that suggested not surprise, but recognition. It was then they noticed the silence around them. The river that usually roared beside the mill was still. The insects that thrived in the damp autumn air were absent. Even the wind refused to stir the leaves on the skeletal trees. When they moved forward, a strange heaviness filled the space between steps. The men later claimed that the ground seemed to pull at their boots, not with mud or water, but with something less tangible, a resistance like moving through a memory not their own. Each attempt to close the distance to the boy left them further away than before, as though the clearing itself had stretched in defiance of geometry. One man, a blacksmith of considerable strength, managed to cast his rope, but before it could touch Thomas, it unraveled mid-air, the strands falling to the ground. Like brittle straw, no sound accompanied the unraveling, not the snap of fiber, nor the hiss of air. It simply ceased to be rope at all. Thomas watched without expression, then turned his head slightly toward the tree line, where something vast and unseen seemed to shift in response. By dawn, only 3 of the 7 men had returned to their homes. The others were never seen again, and no search party ventured near the sawmill for months afterward. The boy remained in town, unchanged by the attempt, as if the night had been nothing but a rehearsal for something far greater yet to come. Whispers spread through the Appalachian hills like frost along a window pane, crawling into every household, yet never fully melting away. The people of that valley began to speak of Thomas Weaver in the same hushed tone they once reserved for old burial curses or the names of drowned men whose bodies were never recovered. Was no longer simply a strange child. He had become a figure that bent the order of things, a walking disruption to what the living understood of the world. Farmers swore their livestock grew restless. When he passed along the road, chickens would refuse to leave their coops, horses would rear and foam without visible cause. Even dogs whose loyalty was stronger than their sense of fear would not follow him. Their instincts had marked something the human mind could not fully acknowledge. A man could choose to doubt, but an animal could not lie. The elders began searching their memories for parallels to such a boy. Stories surfaced of winter-born children who had outlived their entire kin before their 10th year of life, of infants who never cried, yet seemed to watch the room with the gaze of an old man. These tales were always ended with quiet implication, not of death, but of departure. The child would one day simply vanish, leaving no sign of struggle, as though returning to where it truly belonged. By midwinter, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Deaths began to follow Thomas like a shadow, though none could prove his hand in them. An old miner was found at the base of his own staircase, eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. A young woman collapsed in the middle of a hymn, her voice cutting off in the same instant. Thomas entered the church. A merchant from the next town arrived for trade, only to drop dead within moments of shaking the boy's hand. Each time there were no marks, no wounds, no sign of sickness. One night a traveling preacher dared to confront him in the middle of the empty main road. His voice was strong, filled with the righteous fury of a man, certain in his calling. He demanded to know by what right Thomas walked among the living. Thomas answered without moving his lips, yet the words were heard clearly by everyone who later claimed to witness the event. "I was here before you all, and I will be here when you are gone." The preacher left the valley the next morning without his horse, without his belongings, and without ever speaking again. His silence was the loudest warning the town would ever receive, yet few understood it until it was too late. Snow fell that winter in a way the elders swore they had never seen before, not in all their years, in the Appalachian hollows. It did not drift down in flakes, but in thin, straight lines, as if drawn from some unseen hand above, and every line seemed to fall directly toward Thomas Weaver. Wherever he walked, the snow gathered around him in unnatural symmetry, leaving behind strange spirals in the ground that no wind could explain. People began marking their doors with coal crosses, hoping the boy would pass them by. Some whispered prayers from old Celtic tongues brought over by their grandparents. Others recited verses from the Bible in voices so low the words barely left their lips. It made no difference. Those who feared him still saw him standing at the edge of their property in the dead of night, always watching, never moving until the first hint of morning drove him away. A trapper claimed he saw Thomas wandering deep in the forest, well beyond where a boy should survive. The man followed at a distance, certain the cold would finish the child. But instead of slowing, Thomas moved deeper into the snow-covered pines, with an ease that made no sense. Hours passed until the trapper saw him step into a clearing, lit by no moonlight, only by a pale green glow that seemed to leak from the ground itself. In that glow were shapes moving slowly, not like people, not like animals. Something between the two, they seemed to bend toward Thomas, as if in greeting. When the trapper returned to town, he tried to tell what he had seen, but his voice shook so badly that no one could hear him clearly. Within a week, he was found dead in his cabin, with the door still locked from the inside. His eyes were frozen open, and his hands clutched a scrap of birch bark, etched with lines that no one could read. Lines that looked eerily like the spirals Thomas left in the snow. By late January, even the bravest men began avoiding. The roads after dark, the blacksmith, the hunter, and the miller each claimed they saw Thomas reflected in windows he could not have been standing near. His image would appear for only a second. But in that second, it seemed older, sharper, as though the boy's body was a disguise for something far older than the mountains themselves. No one dared to speak it aloud, but the truth had taken root in their minds. Thomas Weaver was not simply a child from the valley. He was a thing wearing the skin of a boy. By February, the townspeople's fear had grown into a quiet sort of obedience. No one tried to confront Thomas now. Instead, they altered their routines, walking different paths to the market, keeping lanterns burning long into the night and never leaving children alone outside. Even the church bell rang less often, as if its sound might draw unwanted attention from the boy and whatever followed him. The pastor, a stern man named Reverend Cole, believed the danger could be driven away through fasting and prayer. For 3 days he locked himself inside the chapel without food or water, and on the third night, those who passed by swore they heard 2 voices inside. One was his, but the other was deeper, slower, and spoke words that cracked like burning wood. The next morning, Reverend Cole emerged gaunt and trembling. His eyes no longer held the same fire when he preached, and his sermons became scattered and strange. He would pause mid-sentence, staring at the far wall as if listening to something only he could hear. Around this time, a miner named Elias Turner returned from the coal tunnels after a week underground. He said that while working in the lowest shaft, he heard a sound like a child humming an unfamiliar tune. The voice echoed so strangely that it seemed to come from every direction. He followed the sound deeper until his lantern flame thinned to a sickly blue glow, and the walls of the shaft began to show markings. Like those spirals in the snow, Elias swore he saw a figure just ahead of him, small and still. The moment he stepped closer, the child turned, and its face was Thomas Weaver's. But the eyes were black as tar. Elias dropped his tools and fled. He never went back to the mine again. By midwinter, there were reports of livestock going missing in the night. Chickens, sheep, even a mule vanished without signs of struggle or blood. Yet each time the snow melted even slightly, the same spiraling pea. Turns emerged near the spots where the animals had last been seen. Some claimed this was the work of hunger or wolves, but a few old women whispered another theory. They believed Thomas was feeding something older than the forests, older than the first settlers, something buried beneath the land that could only be sustained through offerings. And the more Thomas wandered, the more offerings there would be. When the thaw finally came, the land did not breathe relief. Instead, it exhaled something stale and sour, as though the ground itself had been holding rot. Through the long winter, streams ran thick and sluggish, carrying flecks of black silt that stained the stones and left the water tasting of metal. It was during these early spring weeks that Thomas began to appear in places no one could explain. One moment he was seen near the eastern ridge by a group of hunters. The next he was spotted walking the road into town, though no horse or cart could have carried him so fast. Those who tried to follow found the same thing every time his trail ended in the center of another spiral carved into the soil. One farmer named Jacob Wiles claimed he saw Thomas standing in his field before dawn, motionless as the mist curled around his legs. When Jacob called out to him, the boy turned slowly and raised one hand, palm upward. In his hand rested something small and wet. Jacob could not say if it was a stone or a piece of bone, but when the sun broke the horizon, the thing in Thomas's palm seemed to dissolve into smoke. By now the town's children spoke of him in hushed tones. They called him the Hollow Boy, saying that if you looked too long into his face, you could see straight through to the trees behind him. Parents warned their sons and daughters not to wander after dark, but the warnings carried a strange magnetism. Some children claimed to dream of Thomas almost nightly. In those dreams, he would lead them into the woods, walking ahead without a sound, never looking back. Reverend Cole stopped preaching altogether. In March, he was seen only once more standing at the edge of the woods, near dusk, watching the line of trees, with his lips moving soundlessly. The next morning he was gone, leaving the chapel unlocked and his Bible open to a page about the valley of the shadow of death. The margins of that page were covered in the spiral markings. The people of the town began to realize that Thomas was not simply a child who had survived something strange. He was a signal, a living signpost pointing to whatever waited beneath their feet, and with each passing day, the signal grew louder. By mid-April, the wind in the hollows carried a low vibration that was felt more than heard. Windows shivered in their frames, and the animals grew restless. Goats broke their tethers in the night. Dogs paced in circles, refusing to lie down. Chickens laid eggs with shells so thin they collapsed under their own weight. Thomas no longer avoided the town. He walked its dirt streets in daylight, glancing at people with that same slow turning of the head. His eyes held no malice, but neither did they hold life. And yet those who met his gaze reported dreams of impossible things. Vast black corridors that stretched without end. Forests with trees growing upside down, roots tangled in the sky and their leaves buried underground. A river that ran uphill and emptied into the open mouth of the earth itself. The oldest among the townsfolk began speaking of signs they had seen long ago. They whispered of an earlier spring when the same vibration came through the ground, just before a mine collapsed in the next valley, killing 40 men and sealing their bodies in stone. But this time, the sound came not from a mine or any place they could point to. It came from everywhere at once. It was Martha Green who finally broke the silence. She told anyone who would listen that she had seen Thomas place his bare hand flat against the old boundary stone at the north end of the graveyard. As his palm rested there, the stone began to bleed, dark fluid from its cracks. The fluid ran into the grass, and the blades blackened, curling inward like burnt paper. She swore she heard a voice then, but it was not the boy's. It was deeper, older, something that spoke in a rhythm instead of words. At night, more of the spirals appeared, some on doors, some on the sides of barns. One was found on the roof of the schoolhouse, perfectly cut into the shingles without a single mark elsewhere in the wood. No ladder had been used, no footprints in the soft earth below. The people stopped asking how. Those with land near the forest line started abandoning their homes. Some left food cooking on stoves or washing, half done in basins. No one wanted to be the next to see him, standing just beyond the fence, watching and waiting. By the 3rd week of April, the air in Weaver's Hollow carried a taste of metal, like blood in the mouth, after biting the tongue. People found it in their water in the rain, and even in the bread, baked that morning. It clung to the skin long after washing away. The elders said it meant the ground was remembering something buried and trying to push it back to the surface. Thomas had taken to walking in perfect lines, from one end of town to the other, not speaking, not acknowledging anyone. The pattern was so precise that someone laid a string across his path one night to see if he would change course. He did not. He stepped over it without hesitation, as though he could see in the dark. The next morning, the string was gone, and the man who had placed it found his barn door covered in hundreds of tiny spirals, carved so shallow they barely broke the paint, but deep enough that his fingernail caught in them when traced. Children began waking in the night to find Thomas standing in their rooms. Yet their parents swore no doors or windows had been opened. The children reported no fear, only a heavy quiet, as if the air itself had stopped moving. When asked what he did, they would say nothing. He just listened. They could hear something faint, like a whisper, but it came from inside their own heads. It was around this time that Reverend Pritchard finally tried to confront the boy. He met him in the road and demanded in the name of the Almighty that Thomas reveal his purpose. The boy tilted his head slowly, and without moving his lips, a sound filled the Reverend's ears. It was a low, droning tone that bent in and out of pitch until his knees buckled, and he vomited in the dirt. Witnesses swore his hair had turned white at the temples by the time he staggered back to his home. He did not preach again. The forest line crept closer each day, not in a way the eye could catch. But one morning, a fence post would be, swallowed in shadow, and by the next it would be hidden in undergrowth vines, clung to houses that had never stood near trees and roots, pressed up through floorboards in abandoned homes, as if the forest had decided the boundaries of man no longer applied. By early May, the animals had changed. First, the dogs stopped barking at night. Then they stopped eating altogether. Staring toward the ridgeline, as if waiting for something unseen, the cows stood in their pastures with heads bowed and bodies trembling, like they could feel vibrations. No one else could hear. Chickens wandered into the woods and never came back, their feathers found days later woven into strange knots, left hanging from low branches. One night, a hunter named Caleb Morris swore he saw Thomas walking into the trees barefoot, despite the frost. His steps made no sound, and yet every tree he passed shivered as if a wind moved through them. Caleb followed, but the deeper they went, the more he realized the path was folding back on itself. The moon never shifted in the sky, and the same broken log appeared again and again. When Caleb finally turned to leave, he found himself standing in his own yard, with no memory of the walk home. The town meetings turned desperate, but no one could agree on action. Some argued to send the boy away. Others whispered that if they did, the hills themselves would come down upon them. Reverend Pritchard had taken to pacing the church at all hours, murmuring to himself about gates and watchers, and the price of disobedience. Then came the night of the bells. They rang out from somewhere deep in the forest, not the sharp peal of metal, but a muted toll, like they were underwater. Each strike rattled windows and sent cracks crawling along the plaster of walls. People woke to find every mirror in their homes fogged from the inside, with a faint outline of a hand pressed against the glass. The handprints were too small for an adult, but too long and narrow for a child. At dawn, Thomas appeared in the center of town, holding a bundle wrapped in burlap. He placed it on the ground and walked away without a word. No one moved until he vanished into the tree line. When the ope ended, inside was a stone smooth and black as tar, warm to the touch and humming faintly with that same droning tone that had silenced the Reverend. The moment it was unwrapped, every bird in Weaver's Hollow fell silent and stayed that way for 3 days. The black stone did not belong to the mountains. Its surface was too perfect, too deliberate to have been shaped by wind or water. Men who touched it claimed they could hear voices whispering beneath their own thoughts, like a second mind pressing against their skulls. Some avoided it entirely, saying its presence made their teeth ache and their dreams fracture into shards of screaming faces. By the second day after its arrival, the stone began to drink the cold. The air around it warmed despite the frost on the ground, and the snow within 10 feet melted into a perfect circle. Thomas never came near it, but he could be seen at the edge of the woods, watching as men argued over whether to bury it or smash it. The oldest among them said neither would work, that it was not meant to be moved, but to wait until the right hand claimed it again. That night, a strange frost formed, not on the ground, but in the air itself. A mist glittered like crushed glass, hanging between the houses and drifting toward the square where the stone rested. Candles and lamps guttered out without wind. Shadows stretched toward the center, as if pulled by something heavy and unseen. When the mist cleared, every person who had been in the square was standing in a perfect circle around the stone heads, tilted eyes closed, breathing in unison. The reverend, who had not been seen for days, emerged from the church and walked straight to Thomas. No words were exchanged, but both looked toward the horizon where the first red light of dawn bled through the trees. Only it was not the sun rising. The glow came from the other side of the ridge, casting shapes that did not match any living thing of earth. By morning, the circle of melted ground had doubled, and no snow fell inside it, regardless of the sky's fury. The stone no longer hummed softly. Instead, it pulsed with a slow, deep rhythm, like the beating of some vast heart. The elders no longer spoke of sending Thomas away. They spoke instead of preparing for something to arrive, and whether it would come through the boy or for the boy, no one dared to guess. 3 nights later, the ridge erupted in a silent light that bent the tree line into warped silhouettes. The glow was pale at first, but deepened into a color. The human eye seemed to reject a color that made the mind flinch and recoil, even while the body stood frozen. Those who witnessed it would later swear the trees were no longer still, but breathing their trunks, subtly expanding and contracting, as if inhaling something from the unnatural sky. Thomas stood at the edge of the frost circle, where the black stone throbbed like a living organ. His hands were raised, palms outward, not in prayer, but in a gesture of recognition. He was not asking, he was answering. The villagers who had once whispered about him now stood in perfect silence, eyes fixed on the ridge and its unholy horizon. Even the dogs and livestock were mute, pressing themselves to the earth as though weight might protect them from what was coming. From the light above the ridge emerged shapes that bent logic. Their edges shimmered and refused to settle into definition, like trying to focus on a dream. Halfway remembered. They moved without sound, and yet every skull in the valley seemed to vibrate with a droning resonance. The black stone responded to them, its surface rippling like water struck by a heavy drop. Thomas took a single step forward, and the stone's pulse quickened, matching his heartbeat, in a rhythm that spread through the frost circle and into the bones of those watching. An elder woman dropped to her knees, clutching her chest, but her face was not twisted in pain. It was awe. She began to mouth words in a language none had ever heard her speak, her voice dry and thin as paper. Thomas turned his head toward her, and for a moment his eyes caught the light from the ridge, revealing depths that seemed to hold a second sky, one that spun faster than the one above. The ridge glow began to narrow, focusing into a single shaft of light that pierced the frost circle and struck the stone. A sound like tearing fabric filled the air, though no wind moved. The ground underfoot shifted slightly, as if hollow and breathing below. The shapes above slowed their motion, waiting as though something had been invited, and the invitation was finally about to be answered. The shaft of light did not fade, but thickened, becoming almost tangible, like a pillar made of slow-moving liquid. Its surface shimmered with patterns that resembled constellations, but none that belonged to the known heavens. Each star within it seemed to pulse to its own rhythm, as if alive and aware. Thomas stepped fully into the light, his bare feet sinking slightly into the frost, yet leaving no footprints. Behind him, the villagers did not move. Their eyes fixed, their breath shallow, as though the act of exhaling might shatter the moment. When the light touched his skin, it clung to him like a second body, wrapping around his frame and drawing him upward, not off the ground, but into a stance that felt both suspended and rooted. His mouth moved, though no sound came. The shapes above the ridge responded by tilting their forms toward him, their edges briefly sharpening to reveal surfaces covered in symbols that writhed and changed faster than the eye could follow. The black stone beneath the beam began to crack, not in destruction, but as if peeling open, each fracture revealed a dim glow from within a light that was deeper and older than the beam itself. The glow spilled outward, tracing the frost circle with lines of fireless illumination. The villagers watched as those lines crept toward their feet, pausing just short, as if marking the limits of something sacred and dangerous. Then came the voice. It was not spoken aloud, yet it entered every mind at once, a resonance that carried no words, only meaning. It spoke of thresholds of doors that once opened, could never close, and of choices that did not belong to the human will. Thomas's head tilted back, his eyes rolling upward into the endless beam. The voice grew louder, though still no air carried it, pressing into thought until thought itself felt like glass under pressure. One of the younger men staggered forward as though drawn toward the light. Beat. Hoot. The elder woman from before caught his wrist, holding him in place. Her grip was iron, her eyes locked on the boy with a silent warning. He froze, but his breathing became erratic, his gaze locked on Thomas, whose form now seemed slightly transparent at the edges, as if the light was unweaving him, thread by thread. The ridge and the sky beyond began to twist, bending inwards until horizon and zenith felt like they were folding into a single impossible point. The voice ceased, and in its absence the silence became unbearable, a vacuum in which the next sound would decide the fate of all who stood within the circle. The silence broke not with a cry, but with a sound like ice shattering in slow motion drawn out, until each fracture became a note in a song too alien for the mind to grasp. The beam trembled, and the air around it thickened, forcing the villagers to stagger back, as if the very world had shifted weight. Thomas did not fall, instead. His body rose an inch from the ground, the frost beneath him untouched, as though it no longer acknowledged his weight. From the folds of the twisting horizon stepped a figure not quite solid, not quite shadow. Its form bled into the air like smoke in reverse, flowing inward toward itself, until its outline became sharp and absolute. Its head turned slowly, surveying the villagers, though no eyes were visible. Its presence was not simply seen, but felt a pressure that pressed against the ribs and made the heart misstep each beat, like a warning. The figure raised a hand, and the frost circle flared, a brief surge of light that crawled up Thomas's legs and into his chest. His head jerked back, his mouth opening in a silent scream that none could hear, but all could feel like a ripple under the skin. The symbols on the shapes above the ridge flashed in unison, as if answering a command, and the ground beneath the black stone began to lower, as if the earth itself were swallowing it whole. One child whimpered, and the sound cracked whatever fragile pact had been holding the air in place. The figure's head turned sharply toward the sound, and for the first time, something like a face shimmered across its surface. Not human yet, carrying the suggestion of expression. The elder woman stepped forward, shielding the child, and whispering something low and steady, a language none of the others knew. The light from the stone shifted from white to a deep, almost liquid red, and with it came heat, not the warmth of fire, but the oppressive weight of something ancient, pressing up from below. The villagers could smell earth long sealed away, and something else, a faint copper tang that stirred instincts better left sleeping. Thomas's body convulsed once, and then stilled, his form still suspended, but now aligned perfectly with the beam. The figure lowered its hand, and the beam began to narrow slowly, pulling him upward inch by inch. Yet his eyes remained fixed downward, meeting those of every witness, as though marking them one by one, ensuring none would leave untouched by what they had seen. The narrowing beam pulled Thomas higher, until his feet cleared the frost entirely, his body swaying only slightly, as though suspended by unseen wires. The black stone beneath him was now almost gone, swallowed by the sinking earth, but the red light still pulsed in perfect rhythm with his slow ascent. Each pulse sent a faint vibration through the ground, rattling the teeth of those standing closest, as if the earth were trying to hum in unison with the ritual. The figure below tilted its head, in a motion both curious and deliberate, studying Thomas with the patience of something that measured time, in centuries, not seconds. The villagers watched in a trance torn between terror and an unspoken pull to step closer. The elder woman did not move, her eyes locked on the figure, her lips still shaping those same low whispered syllables. Her voice did not carry yet. Somehow the air bent around her words, as if trying to protect them from being heard by anything else. Halfway up, Thomas's body shuddered, and his skin seemed to ripple as though a shadow beneath it were shifting, trying to break free. His hands clenched, then relaxed over and over, in unnatural precision each time they closed. His knuckles whitened, and the shapes above the ridge flared brighter, as if feeding from his movements. One of the younger men finally broke the spell and ran forward, perhaps hoping to pull Thomas down. His foot crossed the frost boundary, and in an instant his body seized. He froze in mid-step, his eyes bulging before his form was flung backward with violent force, landing in the snow several yards away. Steam rose from his skin, though no fire had touched him, and the sound he made was not pain, but confusion, as if a part of him had been erased in that instant. The figure turned slowly toward the man, who now writhed in the snow. It did not move closer yet. The space between them seemed to fold, as though the distance had been removed entirely. For a breathless moment, every villager felt the same thing, a cold thought pressing into the mind. You are all claimed. Above the ridge, the shapes shifted their arrangement, forming a perfect circle around the place where the beam now vanished into the clouds. The air thickened further until breathing became labor. And still Thomas continued to rise, his gaze fixed not on the sky, but on the horizon, as though following something none of them could see. Thomas reached the height of the ancient trees, his body suspended in the cold night air, as though pinned to an invisible wall. The villagers below dared not move, their eyes wide, their breath clouding in frantic bursts. The red beam that held him began to waver, its edges fraying like torn cloth. Yet its pull on him never loosened. The shapes above the ridge completed their rotation, locking into a pattern that no human mind could fully hold without feeling it slip away, like water through clenched hands. The figure below lowered its head in something resembling reverence, or perhaps command. The elder woman finally stopped her, whispering, her hands falling limply to her sides, as though her strength had been siphoned into the ritual. A strange sound followed, one that seemed to come from inside the earth itself. A slow groan, like stone grinding against stone, and beneath it a faint wetness, as though something deep underground had begun to stir after centuries of stillness. Thomas's eyes opened wider than should have been possible, their whites glowing with the same crimson as the beam. His mouth moved, but no sound came yet. The villagers swore. They could feel words brushing against their minds, heavy and cold, like chains sliding across stone. Not all who walk this earth were born upon it. The beam fractured into countless threads, each thread latching onto something unseen in the sky and pulling. The air grew thinner, the temperature falling until the frost beneath their feet cracked like old glass, and the breath of every villager crystallized before them. The shapes above began to dissolve, their glowing fragments drifting down like embers that gave no heat, only silence. Then, with a suddenness that felt like the snap of a trap, the beam vanished. Thomas fell, but not to the earth. Instead, his body simply was not there anymore. No descent, no impact, no trace, save for a faint ring burned into the forehead. Ost, where he had first stood. The figure raised its head one final time toward the sky, then stepped backward into the black stone, which closed over it without a sound. The villagers remained frozen in place, unable to speak, unable to leave, as the elder woman finally turned to them. Her eyes were gone, replaced by the same empty red light, and her voice, when it came, was nothing human. You have seen what was never meant to be seen, and it will follow you beyond the grave.